The hum of the airplane cabin buzzed around Danielle Carter as she finally sank into seat 14C, an aisle seat she had reserved weeks in advance for extra legroom. After back-to-back meetings in New York, all she wanted was to settle in, put on her noise-canceling headphones, and tune out the world for the next 3 hours. She adjusted her silk blouse, set her tablet on the tray table, and exhaled slowly. The exhaustion from her business trip clung to her, but at least she had a comfortable seat for the flight home. As she reached for her water bottle, a shadow loomed over her. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the ambient cabin noise. Danielle looked up to see a blonde woman in her mid-40s, designer sunglasses perched on her head, a Louis Vuitton handbag slung over one arm. Her manicured fingers rested on the shoulder of a young girl, no older than 8, clutching a pink backpack. "My daughter needs the window seat," the woman announced, her voice expectant, not asking, demanding. Danielle blinked, taking in the woman's impatient stance, the subtle flick of her wrist as if dismissing any possible argument. "Sorry?" Danielle asked, keeping her tone neutral. "She gets anxious on flights," the woman continued. "She needs to look out the window to calm down. You understand, right?" Danielle processed the request for half a second before shaking her head. "I booked this seat weeks ago," she said politely. "I'd like to keep it." The woman's smile tightened, her lips pressing together in an almost pained expression, as if she couldn't believe Danielle was actually refusing. "She's just a child," she tried again, voice sweeter now, but dripping with condescension. "Surely you can move for her." Danielle didn't miss the shift in tone, the subtle attempt to guilt-trip her. But she had spent years in boardrooms facing entitled men who thought they could talk down to her. She wasn't about to be bullied out of her seat by an entitled mother. "I'm sorry," Danielle repeated, firm but calm. "But I'm staying in my seat." A brief silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then the woman's pleasant facade cracked. "You're seriously not going to move?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Danielle simply lifted her tablet, scrolling through her emails, refusing to engage further. The woman's nostrils flared. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, before spinning on her heel. As she stormed off toward the front of the plane, Danielle felt the weight of eyes on her. Some passengers glanced away quickly, while others offered small, knowing smiles. Across the aisle, a middle-aged white businessman in a navy suit gave her a small nod, one of those silent gestures of recognition. Danielle sighed, rolling her shoulders to release the tension creeping into them. This flight was going to be longer than she expected. Danielle kept her gaze locked on her tablet, pretending to read an email she had already skimmed 3 times. She could still feel the lingering tension in the air from the earlier encounter, but she wasn't about to dwell on it. Then the sharp clack of heels against the airplane floor returned, and with it, the entitled voice that made her shoulders stiffen. "You know," Karen huffed, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear, "I just can't believe how some people can be so inconsiderate." Danielle took a slow, deep breath before glancing up. Karen stood in the aisle, arms crossed, her expression twisted in exaggerated disbelief. "You're a grown woman?" Karen continued, her voice taking on an almost theatrical tone, as if performing for an audience. "And my child needs comfort. You're really going to take that away from her?" Danielle didn't react, refusing to engage in the performance. A few passengers glanced over. Some shifted uncomfortably, eyes flickering between Danielle and Karen. Others exchanged looks, as if debating whether to step in. So Karen took their silence as encouragement. She sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Wow, just wow." She turned to a young couple seated nearby. "Can you believe this? A little girl is scared of flying, and this woman won't even switch seats." The couple looked caught off guard. The man awkwardly adjusted his watch, while the woman offered a small, uncertain shrug. Danielle kept her expression unreadable. She had seen this tactic before. Make a scene, play the victim, turn public opinion against her. When she didn't respond, Karen's patience finally snapped. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" Her voice pitched higher, eyes narrowing. "You just don't care. You're being difficult for no reason. Danielle inhaled slowly, deeply, refusing to be dragged into a shouting match. I have no reason to move, she said, her voice measured and calm. I paid for this seat, just like you paid for yours. Karen let out a mocking laugh. Oh, so now it's about money? She turned back to the watching passengers. Typical. Danielle's jaw tightened. Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only Danielle could hear. I see how it is, she whispered, her tone dripping with unspoken meaning. Danielle knew exactly what she was implying. Her hands curled into fists for half a second before she forced them to relax. Karen straightened up and flashed an exasperated smile at the passengers still watching. Fine, she announced. If common decency doesn't work, I'll just take this to someone who actually has authority. With that, she spun on her heel, storming down the aisle toward the front of the plane. As she walked away, Danielle heard it, a barely audible mutter, sharp and bitter under Karen's breath. Should have known. Danielle's stomach tightened, a familiar cold frustration washing over her. Across the aisle, the businessman from earlier, Mr. Reynolds, shifted slightly in his seat. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he offered a single subtle nod. A silent acknowledgement, a quiet understanding. Danielle exhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't over. Danielle focused on her breathing, keeping her hands calmly folded in her lap as she watched Karen march toward the front of the plane. She knew what was coming next. It always followed the same pattern. Someone entitled, angry, convinced they were owed something they had no right to demand. And when they didn't get it, they ran to authority, expecting to be validated. Karen reappeared minutes later, triumphant. Behind her walked a young black flight attendant, her curly hair neatly pinned back, her uniform crisp and professional. Her name tag read Amelia Johnson. Danielle kept her expression neutral as Karen waved a dramatic hand toward her. There she is, Karen exclaimed loudly, making sure the entire row heard. I want this seat situation resolved immediately. She's refusing to move. Amelia's calm gaze shifted to Danielle. Ma'am, Amelia said, her tone polite but professional, can I see your boarding pass, please? Danielle wordlessly retrieved it, handing it over. Amelia examined it, nodding. Miss Carter, you're in seat 14C, correct? Yes, Danielle answered. Amelia turned to Karen. And your name, ma'am? Karen tilted her chin up. Karen Whitmore. And my daughter, Lily. Amelia tapped her tablet, her expression giving nothing away as she scrolled through the flight's seating chart. Then she looked up. Miss Whitmore, you and your daughter are assigned to row 22, seats A and B. The entire row went silent. Danielle bit the inside of her cheek to keep her face blank. Karen's smug confidence wavered for the first time. Yes, but row 22, Amelia repeated. That's nowhere near this row. Karen's nostrils flared. I don't see why that matters. That seat is empty, and my daughter needs the window. Amelia remained composed, speaking firmly but professionally. Miss Carter paid for this seat, she said. She has the right to keep it. Karen's mouth fell open slightly, as if the words physically stunned her. Then, her shock turned to anger. So you're saying, she began, her voice rising, that you're prioritizing this woman over a child? A few passengers exchanged glances. A couple of them had pulled out their phones, quietly recording. Karen turned to them, trying to gather support. This is discrimination against mothers, she declared. What kind of airline treats families this way? Amelia's expression remained unreadable, but her voice held an edge of finality. Miss Whitmore, your assigned seats are in row 22. You can move there now, or I can request assistance to have you deplaned. Your choice. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Danielle felt the tension crackling in the air, the weight of 1,000 silent expectations pressing in from all directions. Karen's face burned red. Her eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. Nothing. No one spoke. Even the businessman across the aisle, Mr. Reynolds, simply watched, his arms folded over his chest. Karen's breath hitched, her mouth opening, then closing, as if she were trying to find a way to argue but coming up empty. Then finally, she exhaled sharply through her nose. Her body stiffened, her hands clenching around the strap of her designer handbag. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. With a final huff of indignation, she grabbed her daughter's hand and stormed down the aisle toward row 22. As she disappeared, the plane remained silent for another beat. Then, someone let out a low chuckle. And just like that, the tension broke. Amelia turned back to Danielle. "I apologize for the disturbance, Miss Carter," she said genuinely. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Danielle allowed herself a small smile. "No, thank you." Amelia nodded, then walked away. As Danielle settled back into her seat, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the air. A few passengers glanced at her with quiet approval, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. Mr. Reynolds gave her a small nod once again. Danielle exhaled. This flight might still be long, but at least for now, peace had been restored. The cabin had just started to settle when a sharp sniffle broke the silence. Danielle sighed internally. She already knew what was coming next. Karen had barely reached row 22 when she spun back around, her face flushed, eyes wet, and her lips trembling like she had just suffered a grave injustice. "My daughter," Karen's voice wavered dramatically. "She's traumatized. She's terrified of flying, and now she has to sit without a window to calm her down. What kind of person does that to a child?" Her words were deliberately loud, meant to force guilt onto Danielle and gain sympathy from other passengers. A few travelers exchanged awkward glances. One woman rolled her eyes and whispered to her husband, "Oh, give me a break." A couple of teenagers in hoodies and headphones nudged each other, suppressing amused smirks. The businessman across the aisle, Mr. Reynolds, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, finally let out an exasperated sigh. "Lady," he said, his voice carrying across the row, "just sit where you're assigned and let the rest of us fly in peace." A soft chuckle rippled out through the cabin. Karen's head snapped toward him, her expression flickering between shock and outrage. "This isn't about me," she snapped. "This is about my daughter." Karen whirled back to Danielle, her eyes burning with frustration. "I hope you're happy," she hissed. "You ruined a child's flight. I hope that makes you feel good about yourself." Danielle, still calm as ever, simply turned her gaze toward the window, completely ignoring Karen's tantrum. That made Karen even angrier. She opened her mouth to continue, but before she could, Amelia, the flight attendant, returned, her expression now far less patient than before. "Miss Whitmore," Amelia said, her tone firm, "this is your final warning. Either take your assigned seat, or I will have to notify the captain." Karen's breathing turned shallow, her hands gripping the strap of her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a moment, it looked like she might argue again. Then she exhaled sharply, jerked her daughter's hand, and stormed back down the aisle toward row 22, muttering furiously under her breath. Danielle didn't even glance in her direction. She simply watched the clouds outside, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on her lips. Karen stormed down the aisle, gripping her daughter's hand so tightly that little Lily stumbled to keep up. Her heels clicked aggressively against the cabin floor, her face still red from humiliation. Just as she reached row 18, she whipped around one last time as if hoping to catch Danielle looking at her, maybe to gloat, smirk, or show some kind of satisfaction. But Danielle didn't even glance up. She was calmly staring out the window, completely unbothered. That only made Karen angrier. She took a deep breath, turned back around, and slammed straight into a flight attendant carrying a tray of drinks. The collision was instant and messy. A full cup of steaming hot coffee tipped over, sloshing directly onto Karen's expensive beige blouse. The gasp she let out was so sharp, half the cabin snapped their heads toward her. "Ah, are you kidding me?" Karen shrieked, jerking back. The flight attendant gasped, horrified, instantly reaching for napkins. "I am so sorry, ma'am. I didn't see—" Karen, now drenched in coffee, held her arms out as if her entire world had collapsed. Her designer blouse was ruined. Her face twisted in outrage, but before she could unleash another tantrum, a sound cut through the air, a soft snicker. Then another. A few quiet chuckles spread through the nearby rows. Passengers were looking away, hiding their smiles, whispering to each other. It was too perfect, too instant, too much like karma had personally delivered a message to Karen Whitmore. Even the businessman across from Danielle, Mr. Reynolds, smirked, shaking his head slightly. Lily, Karen's daughter, turned bright red, looking absolutely mortified. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small, tugging at Karen's sleeve. "Please stop." Karen froze, her expression flickering between rage and embarrassment. She glanced around, realizing that no one was on her side anymore. She had pushed too far. She had lost. With an angry huff, she snatched the napkins from the flight attendant, aggressively dabbing at her blouse. Then, without another word, she marched to row 22, yanked her bag into the overhead bin, and flopped into her seat, defeated. The plane remained quiet for a moment, everyone soaking in what had just happened. Then, the flight attendant sighed, shaking her head before returning to the front of the cabin. Danielle finally allowed herself the smallest smile. Some justice didn't need to be served by people. Sometimes the universe handled it perfectly on its own. The flight had finally taken off, the cabin now filled with the hum of engines and the quiet murmurs of passengers. Danielle sat back, letting her head rest against the seat, finally allowing herself to relax. Karen, on the other hand, was rigid in row 22, arms crossed, her stained blouse a visible reminder of her karma. She hadn't spoken a word since the coffee incident, fuming in silence. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that her humiliation was far from over. Somewhere near the middle of the plane, a young woman in her 20s, holding her phone at an angle just low enough to avoid being obvious, tapped post on a video she had quietly recorded. The caption, "Angry Karen on a plane gets put in her place. #Karen on a plane." The video hit Twitter and TikTok before the plane even landed. By the time Danielle's plane touched down, the internet had already done what it does best: expose, amplify, and tear apart entitlement. The video exploded overnight. TikTok, over 2.7 million views in just 5 hours. Twitter, #Karen on a plane trended at #3 worldwide. YouTube compilations started popping up. Another day, another Karen, the best public freakouts of 2024. The comments? Brutal. Imagine thinking your kid is the main character of a whole airplane. The flight attendant was even done with her. Sis held her ground with the same energy as Rosa Parks. I stand. And the coffee spill? Perfection. The universe did its job. Memes followed immediately. One had a screenshot of Karen mid-rant with the caption, "When you realize privilege doesn't override assigned seating." Another showed Danielle calmly looking out the window with the words, "Unbothered, moisturized, in her lane, thriving." The internet had chosen a winner, and it wasn't Karen Whitmore. By the next morning, major news outlets had picked up the viral moment. CNN, headline, "Plane passenger refuses to move, entitled mother has meltdown." NBC, social media reacts to Karen on a plane. Another example of white privilege. BuzzFeed, did this woman deserve to get kicked off? Twitter thinks so. Journalists analyze Karen's behavior, calling it a classic example of entitlement and racial bias. It wasn't just about a seat change anymore. It had become a conversation about privilege. And that's when things really got bad for Karen. By lunchtime, someone had found Karen's LinkedIn profile. It took less than an hour for her employer, a mid-sized marketing firm, to start getting flooded with emails and tweets. "Why do you employ racists? Does your company support discrimination? Fire Karen Whitmore, or we stop doing business with you." Her employer, not wanting bad PR, released a quick statement. "The views and actions of Miss Whitmore do not reflect the values of our company. We are reviewing the situation internally." Translation? Karen was about to lose her job. While Karen's life was falling apart, Something unexpected was happening to Danielle. Someone had linked Danielle's professional profile under the viral video. Her LinkedIn? Blowing up. Hundreds of new connections. People admiring her grace under pressure. A corporate diversity inclusion firm sent her a private message. We'd love for you to speak at our next leadership conference. Your composure and confidence are inspiring. Danielle stared at the email for a long moment, then chuckled softly. She had simply been fighting for basic respect on a plane. And now, she was being offered a career-changing opportunity. Meanwhile, Karen? Well, Karen was about to learn that what happens on the internet stays on the internet forever. 1 week later, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the morning sunlight spill across her apartment floor. Her phone buzzed. New email. Whitmore Associates. She raised an eyebrow. Karen's company. Opening the email, she skimmed through the all-too-predictable statement. We would like to inform you that Miss Whitmore is no longer employed at our firm. We deeply value inclusivity and professionalism and do not condone any behavior that contradicts our company's core principles. Danielle took a slow sip of her coffee, smiling at the irony. Karen had tried to take her seat. Now she had lost her own. Danielle tapped open Twitter, curiosity getting the best of her. And there it was, Karen's second viral moment. A new video taken from a local news station, now making the rounds. Karen Whitmore, red-eyed, blotchy-faced, sitting on a newsroom couch, crying into a tissue. The headline below her, Fired Karen on a plane speaks out. Cancel culture ruined my life, Danielle exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Karen wasn't apologizing. She wasn't admitting she was wrong. She was playing the victim again. The clip started rolling. This isn't fair, Karen sobbed. I was just trying to get a better seat for my daughter. And now, my career is over. I'm being harassed. I can't even go to the grocery store without people recognizing me. Danielle scrolled through the comments, already knowing what she'd find. Ma'am, you did this to yourself. White privilege didn't work this time, huh? Actions have consequences. Enjoy unemployment, sis. Karma always knows the right time to strike. Danielle smiled at that last comment. She didn't need to say a thing. The world had already spoken, and justice had been served.